Great. Okay. I actually meant to leave you with something at the end of the last lecture that I just want to come back to for a moment, which is much as I had talked about the virtues of this model, it also obviously has some important limitations. You can start to see this. This is the Katz-Murphy model. Remember that their data were fit to 1987. So here you can take their model and extend the data, extend it out of sample all the way. This is done through 2003. And this is, what I'm doing here is exactly taking the point estimates from running the data through 1987 and then just seeing how it does with the evolution of taking supplies as given, looking at wage inequality, asking how well this model fits. Well, the answer is it fits extremely well through 1992, and then it starts to diverge. And in particular, it predicts much more growth in wage inequality than we actually observe in the data. It over-predicts wage inequality, and the reason is, or not the reason, but the approximate reason is that supplies continue to grow very slowly. And if you assume that demand is moving outward at a constant rate, you would have to predict a lot of continued expansion of the college-high school wage differential. And we see it expanding, but not as quickly as the model would suggest. Another way to see that is to look at wage changes by wage percentile over different periods. So this is the period from 1980 to 1990. And you can see that wage growth by wage percentile is roughly linear in wage percentile. In other words, at the bottom of the distribution you see sharp wage declines. At the top you see extremely sharp rises. And throughout it's roughly monotone in initial wage percentiles. And that really characterizes the period of the 1980s, but it turns out not to characterize the more recent era. And so if you just look one decade later, this is changes in percentiles over the 1990s. And you can see the top part of the distribution is rising similarly. However, the middle is relatively stagnant, and then the bottom is growing relative to the middle, right? And you see this U-shaped growth of wages. And I should say also, by the way, this whole locus is shifted upward, reflecting the very rapid productivity growth that occurred in the mid-1990s, right? So there was a period of actually very rapid wage increases. And this pattern is going to be very difficult to explain in terms of our simple two-factor model, right? Because the two-factor model is essentially monotone in skill. There's H and there's L, and they can push together or pull apart, but there's no middle. And so to understand this pattern, you're going to need some type of a richer model. Right? So that's what I'm going to come back to tomorrow, but I just wanted to point out that this only, it gets you pretty far, but it doesn't get you all the way there. Okay, good. Now I want to move on to trade, and again, I'm going to do a mixture of slides and overheads. I apologize that this is not an optimal technology. But I want to ask how we should think about trade within the same set of tools that we're using for understanding wage determination. Well, here's that bum slide again. So as a starting point, in the canonical framework, the way we're going to think about countries interacting in terms of wage setting is through prices, right? Because when countries trade, they don't trade factors, not directly, they trade goods, right? So it's goods prices that will determine factor prices in any conventional trade equilibrium. So you might say, I want to work through the exercise now of, for example, skill-abundant economies opening to international trade. Oh, maybe let me give you a tiny bit more motivation about that, actually. So if you look in the international data, there was a period before the First World War of an enormous amount of international economic integration. And that period came to an end with the First World War. And these are ratios of merchandise trade to GDP through the 1990s. And you can see that the world economies were more open at the eve of the First World War than they were in the 1970s, for example. So in 1913, the US did 6% versus 4%. If you look at Canada, it's all declining. Almost across this row, all these columns, you see a decline in world trade flows. But that starts to reverse itself in the 1970s, actually, not the 1980s. So in the 1970s, if you look at all these numbers, ratios of trade to GDP start to rise again. They do so again in the 1980s, but not as much, not as dramatically. And then in the more recent era, and here I need to go to different data sources, you can see this again. So this is trade flows as a share of GDP for OECD countries. And if you look at the period from kind of 1990 to 2007, there's another very dramatic rise in trade flows. So here's Spain, Switzerland, the US. The US is always at a low number, but increasing very rapidly. And so international trade is a very natural thing to be thinking about when thinking about wage determination. And in particular, it's quite plausible when countries are trading at this magnitude that we should think of their economies as being integrated. And let me just, skip that. Okay, good. So now I want to ask how we can think about that integration with drop everything we know and start again. Okay, so let's think about there being, let's go back to a two-factor model, but now I'm going to reinterpret the same model in terms of goods rather than in terms of skills. So in particular, I said that you could think of that two-factor model as being either an aggregate production function with one good and two factors, or you can think of it as two goods produced with two factors that consumers have preferences over. So in particular, you might start off with something like this. P of the US, for example, or P is equal to P of H over P of L. PH is the price of the high skill intensive good, and PL is the price of the low skill intensive good. So remember we had YH is equal to alpha H times H, YL equals alpha L times L. Is that, that's a little better. Okay, good. So this price is simply times so this is, and by the way, rho minus 1 is, if you just do a little bit of rearranging, is equal to over sigma. It just says that relative demand for the high skill good is downward sloping in output. Okay? So now, looking at those prices, right, you can actually get the following, which is H over WL is going to be equal to this P, which I've written above, times AH over AL. That's correct. Okay, good. So AH over AL. So in other words, the wage of high relative low skill labor, I have to adjust my font for the fact that this marker is wider, right, is a direct function of the price of the good, right, and relative productivity, right. So, and the reason that this is true, right, this is a closed economy version of a fact that comes out of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which is that basically prices of goods determine prices of factors, right? So the price that a factor receives, like the price of wage, the wage of a factor, is not a function of its technical productivity, it's a function of its value marginal product, right? The value marginal product is its physical marginal product times the price that that output commands in the market. Right? So this says that in this economy you can relate the wage inequality to the relative price of the high skill versus low skill good, right? And then of course as long as sigma is greater than 1, a rise in the relative productivity of the high versus the low skill good is going to raise wage inequality. Okay, that's just a starting point. And now we want to think about trade integration in this very simple setup. In other words, imagine a country in autarky that's a relatively skill-abundant country. So it has relatively abundant supplies of high-skilled labor, and it's going to be opening to trade with the rest of the world. And and the rest of the world is relatively less skill-abundant than the country than this autarkic country. I say, well, how is that going to affect prices? How is that going to affect wages? Well, it's very simple to see that. Imagine that, let's say, H over L of world less than H over L, and I'm going to switch notation here. I'm just going to say, I'm going to make that H for home. Okay? So the home is relatively skill abundant. Well, when these countries integrate, it's as if their factor markets are going to integrate. And so we can think of there being a change in the relative supply of skill versus unskilled labor, or high versus low skilled labor in the home country. So the price of on the world market of this good is going to be equal to AH times, I'm going to say H plus HW, right? AL times LH plus LW, right? And you can see what that's going to do is, since the yeah, sorry, that's right, to the rho minus 1, right? Yep. Okay, so what that's going to do is that since the world relative contribution to low skill, to the denominator, is larger than the world relative contribution to the high skill, which is the numerator, right, this is going to have the effect that PW greater than pH. In other words, integration to trade of a relatively skill-abundant economy with a relatively unskill-abundant world is going to raise the price of high-skill goods, right? And of course, by implication, right, it's going to be that W, the world relative wage of high versus low skill labor, is equal to PW times AH over AL, right, is going to be greater than WH. Okay? So in other words, this says if we just had trade integration between high skill and low skill countries, right, this would have the effect of raising prices of high skill goods in high skill countries, and therefore raising relative wages. And conversely, in developed economies, for example, the price of high skill intensive goods would fall, right, and wage inequality between high and low skill workers would fall, right, because as the home country integrates, it becomes relatively skill scarce, and as developed economies integrate, they become relatively more skill abundant, right? So it's just kind of an averaging of the two. All right, so that's the kind of very, very simple analytics of this framework. But now we're going to expand it, okay, in a number of ways. So first of all, it's actually useful to think of there as being, instead of just having these two goods that are produced with this linear single factor technology, it might be more useful to think about there being two goods. So I'm going to have YH is going to be equal to, let's say, let's say AH, H, LH to the row plus sorry, I apologize. That's an L. This would be AH. Oh, sorry. All right, new slide. Okay. Not only are we going to go with a new slide, we use a new color. Okay. Okay. So let's see. YH is going to be equal to AHH times H to the rho plus ALHL to the rho over 1 over rho, and YL is going to be equal to AHL to H rho plus ALL times L rho over some 1 over rho. And what I'm assuming here, did I get that right? It's just okay. Yeah, that's okay. I think that's right. So the only thing, okay. So all I need here, let me just make clear, AL for the H good greater than AH over AL for the L good, and also sigma greater than 1 in these production functions. Okay, so all I've done here is, oh, I see what you're laughing at. Okay, is that, okay, well, that's all right. Okay, good, thank you. Okay, good, okay, so I'm now going to look at the case with two goods, right, and these two goods are produced simultaneously, and they have different factor intensities, right? So you can think of the H good as being the relatively skill demanding good, and the L good as being the relatively unskill demanding good. And the reason I've done this, rather than just sort of use the simple linear case, is I want to have smooth production trade-offs within sectors between different factors, okay? Now I'm going to, okay, so now I'm going to imagine a setting that uses a set of very specialized assumptions, which are the assumptions that you would use for the Heckscher-Ohlin model. Okay, so how many of you have seen the Heckscher-Ohlin model before? Okay, so not all of you. Okay, okay, good. So I'm going to make a number of assumptions that I think are quite important. Okay. Okay, so one is we're going to be using constant return to scale production technologies throughout. Two, we're going to assume that we have perfect competition, so I don't have to worry about the complexities of monopoly. Three is we're going to be so-called inside the cone of diversification, which simply means that both goods are going to be produced by both the domestic economy and the rest of the world in equilibrium, right? So we're not going to have full specialization. When we move into full specialization, things change. They don't change in a way that we can't interpret, but it's discontinuous. So we're not going to focus on that case. And then we're also going to assume that preferences are homothetic. So homotheticity in preferences simply means there's no income effects, right? So each indifference curve is essentially just a linear projection of any other indifference curve, right? So as incomes rise, we continue to spend the same proportions effectively. Well, it doesn't have to be the same proportions, but the demand for goods doesn't change disproportionately towards one good or another as incomes rise or fall. Okay, and finally, we're going to initially assume that world prices are parametric. Okay, meaning that each country is a price taker in the world market. Okay. Okay. Now I'm going to consider 4 different cases of what happens in this model. I'm going to do this visually under different scenarios. So the first one is going to be opening to trade in a skill-abundant economy. So the case that I just did with equations a moment ago, I'm now going to imagine a skill-abundant economy that was in autarky, and it's going to open to trade with a relatively less skill-endowed world, and ask how that affects different things, particularly inequality. Then I'm going to consider Hicks neutral technical change. Excuse me. Hicks neutral technical change, right? Which is going to in the skill sector, in the skilled good. And Hicks neutral technical change is change that's equally complementary to all factors, but I'm going to have it only occur in one sector, which is, and that sector being the skilled sector, the skilled goods sector. Then I'm going to consider skill bias technical change in both sectors, where a skill bias technical change is a change that raises relative demand for one factor over another at given prices. And then finally, I'm going to consider a skill bias technical change that is pervasive. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Okay, so here's what I want you to keep your eyes on. Oh, maybe I can use the other slide for this. Okay, so here's what you want to be paying attention to as you work through these cases. One is going to be relative wages, which can be WH over WL, for example. The second thing is skill intensity, which you might say H over L in okay. I'm going to change notation for confusion, but for clarity. Okay, so I'm going to have in the H over L in the skill-intensive good, and H over L in the unskill-intensive good, right? So I'm going to have the two goods, and look at skill intensity, and then I'm going to look at sector size, which is going to, you can think of as being YS over YU, right? So output of the skill-intensive good, output of the unskill-intensive good, okay? So as we work through these cases, you should be thinking about what is happening to each of these quantities. Yes? Are they still, they're going to be you mean, is there only one set of relative wages? No, it's, okay, so wages are attached to skills, not to sectors, right? So it's going to be the case in this model that if both goods are produced in equilibrium, then it needs to be the case that the wage for high and skilled labor is the same in both sectors, right? That would be the kind of that would be a kind of a market clearing condition, right? Because otherwise people would be flowing across sectors until that was true. Okay, so that's right. So there's basically going to be, there's a relative wage, there's skill intensity in each sector, and there's going to be output of these goods, and implicitly there's also going to be goods prices. Okay? All right. So let me start with these. So let me walk you through a useful tool, which is the so-called Lerner diagram. Okay? Is that too big? Oh no, that works. Okay, so this is your after Abba Lerner, who was a University of Chicago economist who first drew these cool pictures. Okay, so over here you're going to have low-skilled labor. Over here you're going to have high-skilled labor. Okay, and we're going to represent the output of sectors using ISO value curves. Now an ISO value curve is different from an isoquant because it's not a fixed quantity, it's a fixed market value of a good, right? So it's a function of quantity times price, all right? So let's do the following. So let's call this, so this is going to be the ISO value curve of the high skill good. This is going to be, oh, if we said the high skill good, sorry, all right. That's going to be S. That's going to be S. Okay, good. This is going to be the ISO value curve of the low skill good. Okay. And so each of those two, right. That one's easier. Perfect. Okay. Okay. So Okay, so each of those is, so everything on those ISO value curves, right, corresponds to the same world price, the world value of these goods. Okay, and now going back to the question a minute ago, right, for us to have market clearing, right, in this market, it needs to be the case that the marginal product of high and low skill labor is equated across these sectors, right? So the way that can be true is if we draw the following, and this is going to be related to the wage ratio. So in particular, this is going to be related to effectively, let's see, this would be, this is going to be proportional to minus WH over WL. Is that correct? I'm going to come back to that in one sec. The reason that's important is essentially, if you think about the location of that curve, right, or the intersection, if I move this thing out, right, it means that it requires more low-skilled labor to produce the same amount of output if the point of intersection with these tendencies was further outward, which would mean effectively the wage of low-skilled labor would have to be lower. Right? Similarly, if I move this in, if I rotate in this direction, that means that it takes less high-skilled labor to produce a bundle of given value. Right? So in that case, that means high-skilled labor is going to be relatively more higher paid in that setting. Right? So what I want to be clear is inward movements in this line. So if this line moves in this direction, right, that corresponds to a rise in real income. Right? If it rotates in this direction, that corresponds to a decline in the relative low-skill wage, right? And if it rotates in this direction, that would correspond to a decline in the relative high-skill wage. Okay. Yep.
Why is it proportional? Should it just be equal to the ratio of the wages?
Sure. I mean, you mean absolute terms? Yeah. Yes, that's right. I mean, that's correct. That is actually, these are real wages. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I'm thinking about it in relative terms, but they are real wages. That's absolutely right. That's right. Because essentially, you can think about, you can take the good that you're, you can take the output that you're producing, the marginal, and you can go and trade it for either of the other goods. Okay. All right. So let me kind of make a couple points about this picture before we do anything with it. Okay. So one thing you can see is that the wage ratio of high and low skilled labor is equated across sectors. Right? So in other words, WH over WL S is equal to WH over WL U, right? And we see that because of the tangency of the ISO value curves, right? So they have to have the same marginal product. If that weren't true, that we would have to reallocate labor production until it was true. Okay, let me draw this. This is the output expansion path, right, of each sector at given prices, right? Now, this basically says the slopes of these lines correspond to the relative demand for skill in each sector for a given wage ratio, right? There's one wage ratio, it's faced by both sectors, right? But it's got to be the case that, let's see, what was the term I used here? Okay, good. H over L S greater than H over L U, right? So the skilled good for at given prices is using relatively more skilled labor than the unskilled good, right? Okay, now there's a third condition which you can't see in this picture, which has to do with market clearing in the labor market, right? So this is essentially giving us market clearing in the from the firm perspective, right? Which is it's it's paying the marginal product of labor to each of the factors. This is telling us about relative demands at those prices, but we also need to know the labor market is going to clear, meaning that there's going to be the right amount of labor used in each sector, that in equilibrium there's no scarce factors. Sorry, excuse me. There's no scarce. There's no slack factors. There's no excess. Okay. So the way you can see that, you can't see it in this picture. This picture doesn't tell you anything about relative supplies. So to see it, what you might do is you might draw the following box. that could helpfully have been a square, but that's okay. Okay, so this is going to be, this is sort of like a Pareto diagram, actually, except that everything's linear. Okay, so this is going to be the origin for the skilled sector. This is going to be the origin for the unskilled sector. And this is going to be, essentially, this is going to be H of S. This is going to be H of U. This is going to be L of S. This is going to be L of U, right? So just to recall your Pareto diagrams from Econ 1 without trade, right? Sorry, without production. And what you had was two factors that were being allocated between two people, and here we have two factors being allocated between two sectors. So if we think about what do these output expansion paths look like, right? Well, for the skill-intensive sector, right, this line might look something like that, right? So it's, notice that it's, so here's the line that connects them with even allocations between both, right? So the skilled good, right, its output expansion path is that it demands relatively more than the average amount of skill in the economy, right? And here is the unskill intensive good, right? And it's going to demand relatively less skill, right? This is labor, yeah, that's correct, okay. Right? So if you draw these output expansion paths, right, there's going to be one point of intersection, right? And it's going to have the following properties, right? So this is going to be H to the for the skilled good, right? This is going to be this area here. So this is going to make that clear, right? This is going to be H to the for the unskilled good, right? This here is going to be L for the skilled good. Sorry, make that clear. L for skilled good, and this is going to be L for the unskilled good. Okay, so what I want you to take away from that, first of all, is for a given factor endowment, right, which is, and the factor endowment essentially is the size of this box, right? For a given factor endowment, relatively more high-skilled labor goes to the skill-intensive than the unskill-intensive sector. Also, that there's only one market-clearing set of allocations, right, that is going to that's going to equate simultaneously have the wage, equality of marginal products across sectors, and have the amount of output of each sector, such as the labor market clears, right? So if we changed, for example, these skill intensities, we'd have to reallocate labor across sectors until we got the right amount of output, right? And so it's going to be important when we come back to this because the allocation of labor across sectors is going to have implications for the amount of output by each sector, which may have implications for prices. Yes?
Right. So wouldn't that apply that you need the assumption for a model that labor can move from one country to the other country?
No, sorry, this is one country now we're looking at. Right, yeah, so these are two sectors in one country. Yes, no, so we do not want to assume perfect mobility of labor across countries. Yes, good. Okay, good. All right, so now, all right, great. So now, okay, so now I want to ask, what happens in this model when we open to trade with a less skill abundant world? Okay, so let's be clear. When we're going to open to trade with a less skill abundant world, and this is not a technological change, right? This is a change that occurs through relative prices of factors, right? So you can think of this as a change that occurs through an increase in the relative price of the skill-intensive good, right? Because we know skill is relatively abundant in the home country, so the skill-intensive good will be relatively inexpensive, right? Skill is relatively scarce in the rest of the world, so the skill-intensive good will be relatively scarce, and therefore it will be relatively expensive. So when we, from the perspective of this autarkic economy opening to world markets, when it opens to trade, it's like an increase in the price of the high-skilled good, right? Okay, so we can represent that in this diagram as an inward movement of the ISO value curve for the high-skilled good, right? So it's going to look like that. Okay. Now, let me just underline the assumptions here that are going on. I think this is quite important. One is, right, we said this country is a price taker, right? So in other words, it's just facing the world relative price. It's not that it's changing the world relative price. It's just all of a sudden introduced to trade. Okay. Two is that all these countries have the same technologies, right? So this is not a question of, opening to trade. So what determines in this model, what determines differences in prices across countries is not technologies, it's not tastes, it's endowments, right? Now you can generalize that, but it's not necessary to do so. Okay, so we're going to open to trade with the rest of the world, right? And that's going to cause this thing to move inward, right? Okay, so now how is the market going to re-equilibrate? Right? We have to have adjustments on several margins, right? We have to have adjustments in relative wages, right? We have to have adjustments in relative supplies of labor across sectors, not the total supply of labor, that's fixed, right? And we have to have adjustments in our output mix, right, to clear these things. So in other words, we need to be back in a case where the marginal product of high and low skilled labor is equated across sectors. We need to be back in a case where all labor is used in equilibrium, right? And so that's going to require us to change the mixture of skills and labor both within and across sectors, right? So in particular, you could start by drawing the following line. Right, we're going to attempt to, there we go. Hey. Okay, so this is our new, this would be a new wage ratio, right, that would be consistent with equality of marginal products across sectors, right? So in particular, the fact that it's tangent to both curves means that we're back in a situation where marginal products of high and low skill labor are identical across sectors, okay? Now notice, first of all, what's happened to the wage of high skill labor, right? It's risen, right? The reason we can see that because we've moved downward in this direction, right? Which means that, and the reason that it's risen, of course, is the value of the output of high skilled labor, or the skill intensive good, has risen in world prices, right? So you can now, instead of just getting domestic demand, you have world demand. The world is willing to pay relatively more for it than domestic consumers because they already had an abundance of it. So the output that you produce per unit time has risen not because of any technological change, but because of facing a new higher price, right? So that corresponds to this this downward movement here. Now, as drawn here, right, it's also the case that the low skill wage has actually fallen, right? So in other words, the amount of stuff a low skill worker can buy has fallen, and the reason is because the value of the bundle of stuff, or the thing they were producing, has fallen in real terms, so it's now less scarce than it used to be. Okay? All right, so that's one margin of adjustment, right, is real wages. Now, what is that going to imply for the skill intensity across sectors? Well, it needs to be the case yeah, I don't think I drew that perfectly. It needs to be the case, right, if the, so, sorry, actually, so let me go back here. Okay. So this says that basically we have WH over WL W greater than WH over WL A under autarky, right? Okay. Now, since each sector is producing competitively, right, it needs to be the case that they're going to substitute along their production isoquant, right, and they're both going to substitute away from high-skilled labor, right? So if I had drawn this properly, right, it would need to be the case that this point of intersection would be around over here. So let's just, there we go. So in other words, it should be the case that that's going to look like that, and that one looks a little better, right, like here, okay? So if you look at the, these output expansion paths are going to rotate, right, where both sectors are going to demand relatively less high-skilled labor, right? So in other words, it's going to have to be the case that YH over YL, no, excuse me, that's not, excuse me, not Y, excuse me, H over L S, world relative prices less than, sorry, okay, less than H over L S under autarky, and similarly H over L okay, so is that clear? So we have, so both sectors are substituting away from away from high skill to low skill labor, okay? And then, of course, the third condition is the market clearing in terms of mix of goods, right? So in that case, go back to here, we have both sectors are going to become less skill intensive, right, in response to this change. So in particular, this line is going to rotate upward, right, like this. This line is going to rotate inward, like that. All right. That's correct. Okay. Yep. Okay. And so, if you look at the new points of intersection, you'll see a few things. One is, of course, both sectors become less skill intensive, right? However, if both sectors become less skill intensive, it needs to be the case that the sector that's going to increase in size is actually a high skill intensive sector, right? The reason is because if the low skill intensive sector, if every sector is becoming more low skill intensive, then for the fact clear, that means the low skill sector has to contract in relative terms, right, to release labor into the high skill sector as well. Okay, so just to make that clear, let me just summarize, right? So we're going to have so what happens is one is WH over WL rises. Okay, two is that H over L in S, H over L in U falls, right? And three is YH over YL rises. Okay. Now, by the way, let me point out why this is actually rather intuitive, right? You wouldn't want it to be the case that that the relative price of the skilled good rises and then you produce less of it, right? So it's logical that because it rises to prediction, right, that when the relative price of the skilled good rises due to world trade, right, you produce relatively more of it, right? You're allocating more of your labor to that. However, right, from the perspective of each sector, right, the wage of high-skilled labor has risen, right? And since they're all price takers in the labor market, that means that they all try to produce the same good with less high-skilled labor, right? Is that clear? So wage inequality rises, but as it rises, sectors substitute away from skilled labor. Okay? Good. Okay, good. So that's the okay, so that's the sort of the first case. This is the opening to trade in a closed economy. Okay, let me now show you a second case, which looks quite similar, which is this is going to be the case of Hicks neutral. Actually, maybe I can. Let's see if I can do this on the board. Maybe this will be easier. I mean, sorry, on the screen. Okay. All right. This may be easier. Okay, so first let me just walk you through the one we just looked at. Okay, so here we go. This is the this was our initial this is an initial isoquant of the skilled good, iso value curve of the skilled good, unskilled good, intensive good. We have the shift inward reflecting opening to trade. We have this rotation of the wage ratio, right? And that has the effect of raising the high skill wage, lowering the low skill wage, right? And if you look at the output expansion paths, both of them rotate clockwise, reflecting a increase in unskill intensity or decline in skill intensity, okay? So that's opening to trade. Okay, now I want to consider a second case, which is a Hicks-neutral technological change in the skilled sector. Okay, a Hicks-neutral technological change is something that conserves both factors proportionally, right? So typically, if you write a Cobb-Douglas production function, you say, you know, k to the alpha, L to the 1 minus alpha, and then you have some solo coefficient on the outside, right? That would be, you know, gamma times that production function. A Hicks-neutral technological change would be just a rise in that gamma, right? It just multiplies the entire production function so that all output rises, right? So a Hicks-neutral technological change in the skill-intensive sector is going to be something that changes the amount of the high-skill good with given factors, with given inputs, right? And that's going to look exactly like an inward movement in this isoquant again. Right? The reason it looks like an inward movement is you have the same amount of labor, same mix, but now you can produce greater value of output. And of course, world prices are parametric, right? So there's no price change. So you're basically getting more, you're producing more of the valuable good for the same, with the same set of inputs. So that's a Hicks-neutral technological change. And if you work through that, you'll see, right, that what does that do? It does exactly the same thing as opening to trade, right? So it raises the high skill wage, it lowers the low skill wage, it causes both sectors to substitute towards low skill labor, increases output of the high skill good, right? So it's identical to the previous case, all right? Now that's an important point because you know, we've been looking in the first lecture, or the first hour, we discussed technological changes, right, and how they give rise to changes in inequality. And here's a first example of a technological change, okay? But what is it doing, right? Well, what it's doing is it's raising wage inequality. It's also doing this other important thing, which is causing sectors to substitute from high to low skill labor, okay? Now, before I go further with this illustration, let me point out actually an extremely important fact about the rise of wage inequality within countries, which is how this occurred across sectors. So in particular, this is from a paper by Berman, Bound, and Machen, and they're looking at changes in wage bill shares of skilled workers within versus between industries. Okay, so they're looking at each industry, and they have internationally reasonably comparable data for about 15 countries. And they ask, as skill prices change, did sectors become more or less skill intensive? Now, let's be clear. If you know from the perspective of each country, there's an increase in skill supply going on in all periods. That has to be accommodated somehow, right? It's that you get, it's not that there'll be mass unemployment. So either when skill supply rises, either skill-intensive industries will grow, or skill quantities will rise inside of each industry, or some combination of the two, right? There's only two ways to do it. Either the skill-intensive sector grows, or each sector becomes more skill-intensive, right? And the difference between those, of course, depends on what's happening to wages, right? So in the 1970s, relative wages of high-skilled labor are falling in most industrialized economies, as we talked about earlier, right? That decline. So during that period, most of the growth of skilled workers is occurring, or the growth of employment is occurring within sectors, within industries. In other words, every industry is becoming more skill intensive. And that's exactly what you would expect them to do if prices are falling. Right? So if they're just, you know, they're looking around and they say, wow, college labor is getting a lot cheaper, might as well use more of it, right? And so you would expect an exogenous supply shock which lowers relative wages of skilled workers to cause industries to substitute along their production isoquant towards high relative to low skilled labor. Okay, so from the perspective of each industry, the total supply is exogenous. This wage change is exogenous. Now, look at the following decade. Right, in the following decade, is the case that skilled wages, the high skilled relative wage, is either constant or rising in all industrialized economies. Right, so in that case, predict the opposite would occur, right? That each sector would tend to substitute away from skilled labor, right? And so there would actually be decline in skilled labor input within industries, and then the skill-intensive sectors would expand to accommodate that, right? But in fact, that's not what occurs, right? Almost all of the changes in skill input are within. So despite the rising price of skilled labor in all these countries, right, all these sectors are increasing their quantity demanded of skilled labor, right? And you can see this, by the way. So these are the changes in the wage ratios. These are almost all negative. In these cases, they're almost all positive, right? This is the skilled versus unskilled, or high versus low, or production, non-production. And yet in both cases, almost all of the shifting is within. Okay? Now the reason that's relevant to this picture, right, is this says, okay, here's a exogenous Hicks neutral technical change. Now it's Hicks neutral in the sense that it's equivalent across both factors in this sector, but of course it's in the skill intensive sector. Right? And it says, okay, well, wage inequality will rise, right? The high to low skilled wage will rise. But what happens, every sector will shift away from high skilled labor, right? So this picture can't describe or explain these facts, right? Because these facts, because this picture would say when wage inequality rises, for exogenous reasons, sectors become less than skill intensive, right? But in fact, what we see in the data is wage inequality rising and sectors becoming more skill intensive. Okay, yes? Good. Okay, that's right. So absolutely. So you're saying don't treat the prices of goods as exogenous, right? I think. Okay. So that's absolutely right. So this is. I'm not suggesting that the Heckscher-Ohlin model can explain this. I'm saying the case that.
It does not explain the limit. That's true.
No, it can. It can as well. But I'm going to. Well. So I'm going to get to that case, okay? So my point so far was only that the version of technical change that I've just shown you in this picture can't be consistent with the facts that I've shown you, right? Okay, so now I want to expand to another case, right? And the case that I want to consider is skill-biased technical change in both sectors simultaneously, right? So I just did this is what you would call a Hicks-neutral sector-biased technical change. So now I'm going to consider a Hicks-neutral factor-biased technical change, right, which is going to occur in both sectors simultaneously, okay? So in particular, actually, let me draw it. Okay, here we go. So okay, so this is, so here we go. So here is our initial unit value isoquants, right, or iso value curves, right? And now I'm going to imagine a Hicks neutral technical change that's proportionally occurs across both sectors, right? So it increases outputs of both goods, right, of both the skilled and the unskilled goods simultaneously, but increases them in the same proportions, such that when we're all done, right, the amount of the skill and the unskill intensive good that we can produce, right, increases by the same constant. Okay. So what's going on? So clearly, first of all, this wage ratio, the entire locus shifts inward, right, reflecting the rise in productivity, right? So that just reflects a rise in real wages for everybody. Okay. Similarly, okay, if this is really a skill-intensive, excuse me, I apologize. Not a Hicks neutral technical. I apologize. I misspoke. This is a skilled, this This is a skill-augmenting technological change that occurs evenly across sectors. I apologize. Now, looking at the figure, I can see what I had in mind. Okay, so how do I see that? I see that because the way I've drawn the isoquants, this output expansion path shifts counterclockwise, consistent with increasing relative demand for high versus low skilled labor in both sectors, right? So I see it here and I see it here, okay? Now, I apologize for that. And so what's going to happen in this case? Okay, well, several things are going to happen. So first of all, what happens to, this would be H over L in S and H over L in U, right? These are both going to rise. Okay? So in other words, both sectors increase their demand for skilled labor, reflecting this factor augmenting technical change. Okay? So I want to emphasize, right, the things that we looked at, the things that we talked about in the first lecture were basically things that raised H over AL, right? Those were factor augmenting technological changes of the kind, the kind talked about by Katz and Murphy, right? So now I'm essentially imagining, right, I had AH over AL in S, and I had AH over AL in U, right? And I'm imagining essentially they're both being augmented, right, by some constant term, right? So this would be some, gamma greater than 1, right? So AH over AL is rising in both sectors simultaneously. Okay. Okay. Now we said that we said similarly that if both sectors are going to become more skill intensive, right? What actually has to happen to the output mix for the market to clear? What's going to happen to the mixture of high and low, or the S and the U good? Go ahead. That's right. That's absolutely right. So we have to have that basically YS over YU is falling, right? Okay. And then the third thing, right, is wage inequality. So this captures the prediction, right, that within industry skill shifts are positive. In other words, both sectors are increasing the relative demand for high skilled labor. Okay, but then what's happening to wages in this illustration, and why? So, well, as you can see, as I've drawn it, right, the wage inequality has not risen, right? In other words, this is a parallel inward shift, right? So what's preventing wage inequality from changing in response to this change in technology in this picture? It goes back to one of the assumptions I made at the beginning, right, about this being a small open economy, right? So someone help me here. So in the small open economy case, what happens when I have this kind of what do I want to say? It's sort of an autarkic technological change, right? I'm not going to change world relative prices, right, because I'm small. But of course, we already said that wages are a function of prices, right? So in this case, right, if world prices are parametric, meaning they're fixed, and I have this proportionate change, right, that increases, that basically moves both of these iso value curves in by the same amount, right, then I'm going to have more output, I'm going to have higher wages, I'm going to have each sector becoming more skill intensive, but I'm not going to have any change in wage inequality, right, which is kind of a funny case. Okay, so in this case we would have, so the third thing that would happen is WH over WL, right, would be the same, right? No change. Okay. So looking at that, right, it would still be hard to understand the sort of the fact that we have simultaneously rising relative wages and rising relative inputs of high versus low skilled labor in all sectors. So what's the thing that's missing here? Well, so one possibility would be sector specific, right? But another thing, and that certainly would do it, but another thing that's highly rigged or highly unrealistic about this example is it basically assumes that this technological change is occurring in one country, right? And so we can think of it as being a kind of a small country case. But of course that doesn't sound very realistic, right? In general, when we think about technological changes, we think of them being fairly readily available to most economies simultaneously, right? So how does that change this picture? Well, the way it changes it is as follows, right? So initially, imagine we have the same technological change, right? And it's going to raise it raises demand for high-skilled labor in each sector, right? And now this is occurring worldwide, okay? So what we said that's going to raise relative output of the low skill intensive sector, right? Because we're increasing our skill intensity in the low skill, we're increasing our skill intensity in both sectors, right? So that means that output in the low skill intensive sector has to rise, right? Well, imagine that's happening simultaneously worldwide, right? Well, that means that the world relative output of the low versus the high skill good increases, right? Which means that the world relative price of the low skill versus the high skill good has to fall, right? So once we get into that case, what happens again, right, is that this wage ratio again is going to rotate towards high skill workers, right? And so three things are going to happen here. So one is wage inequality is going to rise. Two is all sectors will become more skill intensive, right? And the third is that the output of the high skill good is of the good mix is going to shift backward a bit towards the high skill good. But the key difference here is this, right? Is that we'd have a situation where we would see simultaneously both rising relative wages for high-skilled labor and substitution towards high-skilled labor simultaneously going on within sectors, right? So that would be potentially consistent with this set of facts. Okay, with the kind of rising, with rising relative wages and rising relative inputs of skilled labor going on simultaneously within industries, right? So what you might label this, did you have a question? No, okay, is you could call this a kind of pervasive factor biased technical change, right? Where it would have to be a change that when across a large number of countries simultaneously, right, they would experience a technological change that would cause all of them to sort of simultaneously move towards relatively greater demand for skill, and that would cause world prices to change, right, such that high relative to low skilled labor would become relatively expensive, right? Now, that case is different from the other ones looked at in two senses. One is it makes this prediction of simultaneous rise in wage inequality coupled with simultaneous substitution towards high-skilled labor, right? The second difference is that it also makes different predictions for the pattern of wage inequality across countries. In particular, right, the standard case is whatever occurs in the developing economies occurs in reverse in less developed economies, right? So if opening to trade causes wage inequality to rise in high skill intensive countries, it would cause wage inequality to fall in low skill intensive economies. This alternative story says that if we have pervasive factor bias technical change, right, then we should be seeing wage inequality rising in both developed and developing countries simultaneously, right? Now, I don't think we have great ways to measure this. If you look over the period of the 1980s, this shows you the relationship between changes in relative wages. This gives you GNP per capita, which is a measure of economic development, obviously. And what you see is no obvious relationship, right? In other words, you don't see, you would expect, right, if you in this sort of standard trade integration story, you'd expect a line that looked like this, right? Developing economies see rising wage inequality, and less developed economies see falling wage inequality, but you don't see anything that looks like that. Or if you look at changes in skill supplies, and changes in employment shares, right? What you see, if you look at the, here we go. So if you look at changes in skill supplies versus level of development, again, it doesn't appear that there's any growth in relative supply of skilled workers in low-skilled countries. So if you wanted to explain this story, you'd have to say, well, maybe what happened is all these less developed countries saw a massive increase in skill supply, and that dampened this inequality effect, right? But if you actually look at the data, what you see is essentially no relationship between level of development and growth in skill supply. So it's not a kind of an offsetting supply story that's going on. Now, I'm be the first to admit that these data are pretty crude, so I don't think this is definitive evidence, but I think it's suggestive, and I think much more careful studies have shown, looking across, for example, looking in China, looking across Latin America, that you do see, even in less developing economies, seemingly strong evidence of rising demand for skill. In other words, rising relative wages of skilled workers and substitution towards skilled workers within sectors. Right? So I think it's possible if you want to sort of understand the kind of set of the kind of key facts about changes in supplies, changes in relative wages, and then substitution towards skill, you can understand this within a trade context. But on the other hand, it doesn't, I think the available evidence does not suggest that trade would be the main explanation, right? So you can think about this in terms of a bunch of integrated world economies. However, I think the data are not consistent in the explanation that it somehow increases in, that it's trade opening per se, or increases in trade flows that are actually driving changing skill demands, right? If that were true, in general, we'd expect to see the opposite occurring in developed and developing economies. We don't see that. We'd expect to see sectors substituting away from skilled labor as the price rises. We don't see that, right? Instead, we see this pervasive substitution towards skilled labor despite rising skill prices across economies, right? So that's most suggestive of some kind of underlying production function shift that's making skilled labor relatively more productive. Okay? Okay. Questions on that? Yes?
What about validation of the quantity of output? I mean, it's kind of a cheap shot to say that China's growing faster than the United States. There must be better indicators of what.
Yeah, I agree. And that data is way out of date, right? I mean, the big Chinese integration is not happening in the 1980s anyway, right? Yeah, so I mean, I think that the thing you would also, the alternative thing you might look at is actual goods prices, right? So, you know, these models also make very strong predictions about, you know, the way that this works is through a change in the relative price of the high versus low skill good. And to the extent that people have looked at this, they've not found any evidence that suggests the price of sort of high-skilled goods is rising, right, which is what you would expect in this story. However, I would say the people who've looked at it really knew what they believed going in. So it's not clear that that's great evidence. There's a difficulty with goods prices in trade are really quite messy, right? So I think that people have, so I still say the best evidence comes from the labor market, but I don't think that's, you know, if you had all available data, that's not the place you would look, right? So I think it's more a question of we have more confidence in the labor market data than the sort of quantities and prices data in goods, but a natural place to start looking is goods prices, right? And the work by Bob Lawrence and Matthew Slaughter and others have sort of tried to look at these goods prices and have basically said the goods prices are not suggestive of a kind of a trade-based explanation. Okay, yeah.
So this argument was typically used to, in order to defend or to pursue the hypothesis that skill-based technological trade was more important in explaining the change
Right.
in wage inequality than trade. But now, so this is just trade in final output. So we have this literature on intermediate goods.
Right.
I'm actually always asking myself whether I can dismiss the trade story so easily on the ground. I mean, I love
Right.
this paper, but
Right. Okay. Good. So yeah. So I mean. So first of all, I don't want you to dismiss the trade story. I don't think trade is irrelevant, and I think it's become much more relevant in recent years. But there are two. And since, for example, this paper was published, right? I think that trade has become has accelerated, and even potentially the sort of the disparities in in relative factor endowments between countries that are trading have risen, right? Considering that China has become so much a more important part of the world economy after its opening in the 1980s. So I don't want to suggest that trade is unimportant. I do want to, but it may take a different form, right? And that's sort of where I want to go next to this. So I'm going to walk you through a case, walk you through a specific paper, and I'm going to show you a very clear example of trade effects on patterns of production. And then I'm going to come back and ask about whether or not it is consistent with this model. Okay? So I very much appreciate the question. Okay. So the paper I'm going to talk about is by Che and Wu in the AER in 2005, and this is about Hong Kong's opening to the Chinese labor market, right? So basically, as you know, Hong Kong and China Hong Kong is an island off of China. They're very right next to one another. Historically, they were integrated. They were separated by the British. They reintegrated in the 1980s, and China had extremely protectionist trade policies since the Communist Revolution. And then, basically, in the mid-1980s, Hu Jintao went to the south of China and said, let us have trade. And this caused an opening of China to world markets. And the first and most immediate beneficiary of that opening was Hong Kong, because they shared a common language. They were their distance apart could be measured in meters, and so there was an enormous opportunity for Hong Kong. And I should say, despite the fact that they were culturally similar and geographically proximate, they had enormous differences in skill mix, right? So Hong Kong, a very highly educated society, engaged in all kinds of high technology trade of electronics, of kind of very high machine manufactured high quality apparel, and China, which was abundant in unskilled labor and really not at all specialized in high skilled goods. So this paper tries to ask about the effect of opening to trade with China on the Hong Kong labor market. Okay, so I want to walk you through the results and then come back to how we should think about them. Okay, so let's start off. So first of all, if you look at employment shares by sector in Hong Kong, right, so the big opening is in the early 1980s. You can see that manufacturing is over 40% of the Hong Kong economy in 1976. By 1991, it's only 19%. Right, so it's an enormous, absolutely enormous change. And if you look at traded services, right, they go from 31 to 50% of the of the Hong Kong economy. Agriculture is small and falling throughout. Non-traded services are relatively stable, increasing somewhat. Okay. The way you can see what's going on here, to try to understand it, is if you look at these are domestic exports here, so exports of goods produced in Hong Kong. These are re-exports of non-Chinese goods. So what are re-exports? Re-exports are basically where you take a product or an input and you import it into your country, you export it to a country to have it worked on, then you re-import it and then you sell it to another country, right? So this is essentially the kind of outsourcing modality, right, where you would take some, you would produce some high-tech goods, you would send them to another country to be assembled, you would bring them back in and then resell them to the east, for example, or to the west, excuse me. So if you look at what's happening to Hong Kong, the fraction of GDP that's re-exports of Chinese origin goods, right, goes from essentially 0 to more than 50% over this time period. Really. And again, it's basically 0 through 1980. By the end of the 1990s, half of GDP in Hong Kong is re-exports of Chinese manufacturers. Okay. And another way to look at that, well, all right, let's skip that. Okay, so so now the question is, how would you anticipate that this type of integration would affect the structure of the Hong Kong labor market? Right. So what would you anticipate would occur? Okay. Well, there's several predictions that you'd want to make, right, based on the above. But the most important, right, or at least a natural starting point, is what you would expect to occur in terms of wage inequality. So clearly, right, this corresponds at one level to the textbook case we went through initially of a relatively skill-abundant economy opening to a relatively skill-scarce economy, right? So if we ask what happens to wage inequality in Hong Kong, right? So we're going to have WHWL in Hong Kong, and we're not going to have data on the Chinese economy here. We're just going to have data on the Hong Kong economy, right? We would expect, right, wage inequality to rise, right? And simply because you could think of the relative price of high and low skill intensive goods, for example, right? The high skill intensive goods would be relatively cheap in Hong Kong, be relatively expensive in China. When these markets integrate, right, that's going to mean that the world relative price of the high skill intensive good is going to have to rise. The world relative price of the low skill intensive good is going to have to fall. Okay, that's the first thing. How would you expect this to affect skill inputs by sector? Right? Based on the above, right? Thinking back to the example a few minutes ago of integration between a high and low skill abundant economy through trade. What should this do to skill intensity by sector? That's right. Right? So we would expect, right, the second thing that would occur is, so this would be H over L in S and H over L in U would both decline, right? Because they're both facing higher prices of skilled labor. Okay, so let's go forward on that assumption. Okay, and so let me show you. So first starting point is this is the employment share of O-level plus workers. So these are relatively educated workers in Hong Kong, right? From 1971 to 1996. Okay, so it basically increases quite dramatically, right? Increases from 25% to 60% of the economy. There's a surge in skilled labor availability. We shouldn't think of that as necessarily having much to do with trade, right? That could be a reflection of lots of other policies, right? In manufacturing, right, you also see that occurring. Let me come back to that. Another way that's typically used to measure skill intensity is using non-production workers. Those are workers who actually aren't making stuff, they're just managing stuff. And the reason people often use the non-production versus production distinction is because they don't have measures of education within the sector, but they know what proportion of workers are essentially blue collar, what proportion are white collar, what proportion are the laborers, and what proportion are the managers. So that's why people use that. Okay, so what you see, right, is you see this rise in relative supply of educated workers, right? And now we want to ask, how did that occur? In other words, did that occur? Or sorry, excuse me, how was that absorbed? Right? Was it absorbed by expansion of skill-intensive sectors, or was it absorbed by growth in skill intensity within sectors? Right? Okay. Now, based on what I've just written above, right, you would predict it would occur through a decline in skill intensity within sectors and a growth in high skill sectors. Right? Is that clear? Because from the perspective of each sector, right, they're facing an exogenous shift implicitly in the wage of low skilled labor or high skilled labor, right? Because the integration of these markets depresses the low skilled goods price, that makes low skilled labor cheaper, right? So from there, so every sector looks around and says, low skilled labor is cheaper, I'm going to use relatively more low skill and relatively less high skilled labor, right? Okay, so you can decompose the change in this DT thing is essentially the change in total employment. It's not demand, it's really just quantities, right? Can be decomposed into a change in the size of the service sector relative to the manufacturing sector for given initial skill intensity. The service sector typically is more skill intensive. And then further decomposed is within each sector, you can have a change in skill intensity due to shifts among industries within the sector and to shifts in skill intensity within sectors, right? So if within manufacturing, the high skill parts of manufacturing increase in employment, that will increase skill intensity. If within manufacturing sectors become more skill intensive, that increases skill intensity as well, okay? Let's take a look at that, okay? All right, so what happens? Well, change in the share of high school educated workers. So you can look in each of these periods. This is the aggregate change, okay? The aggregate change, again, think of that as exogenous, right? That's a function of the Hong Kong education system. It's a function of what newer cohorts are doing, right? This is just, sectors do not determine this. Okay, so this is the aggregate change. You can see actually very little of that is that allocation is occurring through reallocation of labor to services, right? It's not moving to the more skill-intensive sector. It's actually occurring within manufacturing, right? And moreover, not is it occurring within manufacturing, but it's occurring within sectors within manufacturing. So in particular, this says that within manufacturing, sectors are becoming relatively more skill intensive, right? So each manufacturing industry is actually increasing its skill inputs rather than substituting away from skilled labor. Okay, and actually, let me point out one thing that's actually, I think this is actually a sort of important background point, right? So if we look at wage inequality measured as the return to education, so the log wage differential for years of schooling, right, it's important to observe that this is rising, right? And the reason that's important is because I showed you there was this massive influx of skilled labor. So this could have been explained by declining return to skill, right? But that's not occurring, right? The skilled wage premium is rising in Hong Kong throughout this period despite growth in skill intensity, in skill supplies, right? So we need to understand we need to understand why are sectors substituting towards skilled labor, right? So here's, okay, good. All right, change in high school, good, okay. All right, very good. All right, so now they propose the following idea. Let's look at the relationship between changes in offshoring within sectors and changes in skill mix, okay? In particular, the dependent variable here is going to be the percentage change in the non-production worker share of the wage bill within manufacturing. And the independent variable is the change in imported inputs over shipments plus, imported intermediate inputs over shipments plus imported intermediate inputs, right? So this is essentially the share of their kind of, I guess sort of the share of value added that's coming from imports, right? And all those import changes are going to be coming from China, right? Pretty clear. So what's happening here? This says the more you're importing, the more you're using high-skill labor, right? So industries that are increasing their employment share, increasing their degree of trade with China, are increasing high-skill labor input, okay? Similarly, if we go forward, right, they have another idea, and they say, well, okay, you're using an endogenous relationship here, but maybe you could find some exogenous source that could predict which industries would respond in this way. Well, the ones that are going to respond in this way are the ones that initially are relatively low-skill labor intensive, right? The more low-skill labor intensive you are, the greater opportunity you have to take advantage of opening to trade with China, right? If you didn't use any low-skill labor, not much to gain. If you used a lot of low-skilled labor, then clearly you benefit from all of a sudden this decline in price of low-skilled labor. And what you find is, and sorry, pointing this doesn't do much good. Okay, so here is the change in the sort of import share at the industry level. level. Here's the value-added share of labor, meaning the share of the production that's low-skilled labor, right? And you can see the higher your value-added share of labor, the more you increased your import intensity at the industry level. If we look at, or alternatively, if we look at places that were, the industries that were relatively high skill intensive, meaning the wage bill share of non-production workers was high, they have relatively less growth in importing, right? So now we're going to use that as an instrumental variable for predicting this change. And here, when you instrument using these initial these initial differences in skill structure, you see that again, sectors that were relatively less skill intensive, right, did more importing and saw a greater rise in skill intensity, right? And that's true when you instrument by the value-added share. It's true when you instrument it by the wage bill share of non-production workers, okay? And so, good, okay, good. So let me come back here. Okay, so we had two predictions, right? And the third, right, actually, okay, the outputs, we can skip the output. Okay, so this one is confirmed, right, that we see a rise in wage inequality. And this one, of course, is counterfactual, right? This is the opposite of what occurred. Okay, so the second prediction is that we should see all sectors becoming less skill intensive, excuse me, more unskill intensive, right? Less skill intensive, and in fact we see just the opposite. Okay, they all become more skill intensive. Okay, so and I think so let me just ask you, so what's actually going on? Why are these sectors becoming more skill intensive rather than less skill intensive? So this is one of those things that you knew at the beginning of the lecture and now it seems less obvious, right? So I managed to confuse you, but why does opening of trade to China cause Hong Kong industries to become less skill intensive? Yes?
Proportion of these sectors is, as far as I know, during this period.
Say again?
As far as I know, during this period, because mainland China is
Yeah?
so in this way, local enterprises many outsource again this lower skill sectors production in China.
Exactly, that's right. So that's absolutely right. So what's going on, right, is they're taking a subset of their activities, right, and they're outsourcing them to China, right? So it's not the availability of abundant source of low-skilled labor has essentially allowed them to break down the production process, right? So instead of just sort of using a different skill mix in your country, you just take a piece of what you're doing and ship it off to China. The piece that you're going to take, obviously, is the less skill-intensive part of the sector, right? So the more you are low skill intensive sector, the more you have an opportunity to basically break off that piece of your production process, do it in another country, and what's left over is, of course, the high skilled labor that is managing that, right? Or that's doing the R&D, that's doing the management of trade, and so on. And so the reason that this looks inconsistent with the model is because the model that I wrote down basically assumes that a production function is a unitary technology that can't be subdivided, right? So you can only just shift the mix of things that you do within countries. But in fact what happens is, turns out the production function is modular, and you can take a piece of it and do it elsewhere, right? So it is the case in net, right, there's more low skill intensive tasks that are being done in production of these things. It's just that some of those tasks are occurring in another country, right? Now, you could rewrite the Heckscher-Ohlin model I put up earlier to get it to make that prediction, but it would be very messy. Because you would need to have lots and lots of sectors, right? And so getting these sort of intermediate inputs into that model is going to be hard. So instead, when we talk about this again tomorrow, I'm going to use a task framework for exploring the same set of phenomena. It's going to reinterpret these facts. It will not deliver anything different from what you've already seen, but I think it'll show you a consistent way to think about it. So starting tomorrow, we're going to go back to the same set of questions and puzzles, but now try and expand the model in a direction that will, I think, fit more comfortably with the facts that we want to explain. Okay, thanks a lot.